Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Jaku and Shinshu are back from Japan, but still not unjet lagged. So they asked me to give the talk today, and I'm gonna, as always, thank them for the opportunity to do that. And I want to thank everybody for being here. I would be sad if I was talking to an empty room. And I want to thank everybody online for being here as well. There's a text that I come back to periodically throughout my time, and it is a series of letters that a Rinzai priest wrote to the swordsmanship instructor for the shogun. And these letters were collected in a book called the Unfettered Mind. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the priest and the swordsmanship instructor. And the point for the priest was to bring forth Zen principles in swordsmanship. And for us, I think we're going to try to bring Zen principles forward in everyday life. But for me, swordsmanship is a good dharma gate. It's a good way to enter these teachings because it's a big part of my life. And there's something that's very visceral and immediate about martial arts. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Takuan Soho, who is the priest, and I'm going to tell you what he had to say. So Takuan was a priest, and he lived from 1573 to 1645. So he was born right at the end of the unification period in Japan, which meant almost 200 solid years of warfare. So that's the world that he was born into. And he is remembered for his strength of character and his acidic wit, which means he was a sarcastic pain in the butt, which is another reason why I love him. I see a lot of myself in him. And he was famous as a gardener, a poet, a tea master. He wrote a lot. He was a prolific author and was famous in Zen painting and calligraphy. He was actually named the abbot of a fairly famous monastery and then walked out after 5 days. That's not good. So he had a very strong character to be able to do that. And he was born to a samurai, but his dad was on the losing side of one of those unification battles. He was on the losing side when Nobunaga was winning, which meant he was born to a Ronin. And so he would have been around martial arts, and he would have also seen what happens when you're on the wrong side of war. And so there would have been this instability in his life, but also this drive to perfect the martial art. Because if you were a Ronin, usually you were trying to find employment somewhere, which meant often engaging in duels so that your fame would be enough that a lord would want to hire you. So he was not a sword master himself, but he was around it his whole life. And I think it had a big impact on his upbringing. And then the other thing to remember about Japan is that even though Japan occupies less than 1% of the land mass on Earth, it's like 0.28%, they get over 20% of the earthquakes that are 6 and above. And 7 of the world's most active volcanoes are in Japan, and they deal with tidal waves and tsunamis and typhoons. And so this warring period and this kind of like natural upheaval that is just a big part of Japanese history, this is the world that Takuan was born into. And so it's said that Takuan really sought to infuse the spirit of Zen into every aspect of life that caught his interest. So that includes calligraphy, poetry, gardening, arts in general, and this includes the art of the sword. The letters that he wrote were to Yagyu Munenori, and the Yagyu school of swordsmanship was probably the most famous school of swordsmanship in Japan. And if there's any martial arts nerds online or in the room, and you've heard of Miyamoto Musashi, Yagyu Munenori was a contemporary of his, and wrote his own book called The Life-Giving Sword. So this is, very like high-level Japanese history and high-level martial arts. And so all 3 of the letters were addressed to the samurai class, and all 3 seek to unify the spirit of Zen with the spirit of the sword. And we're really going to focus on the first letter, because we would be here all day if I tried to go through all 3. And the first letter really focuses on the unification of self, right? And how we engage with that. So he talks a lot about technique, but he talks about how the self relates to the self during confrontation, and how an individual can become unified as a whole. Takuan has several themes in his writing that he returns to again and again. Intuitive response is really big for Takuan. And that's something that if you study the Rinzai school especially, you'd see a big emphasis on this intuitive response. immediacy and intimacy feature heavily, and as do beginner's mind and no mind. So again, for the martial arts nerds, if you ever heard Mushin, right? No mind, that's what I'm talking about. So the first letter is broken into various essays or chapters, and the first chapter, I think, catches us because it's the affliction of abiding in ignorance. And I feel like the affliction of abiding in ignorance is probably what brought a lot of us to Zen practice. So Takuan starts by defining ignorance as the absence of enlightenment, which is to say delusion. Simply put, for Takuan, when we don't see what's really going on, we're operating from delusion. So it's very simple in concept, right? When we don't see what's really going on, we're operating in delusion. And then he goes on to say that the abiding place is where the mind stops. And that abiding place is really important. I just want to briefly mention, because there is always some assumed knowledge when we're reading period manuscripts. He talks about the 52 stages of the Bodhisattva path, or 52 stages of enlightenment. And this is not something that's talked about in Soho Zen very often, because that's not our emphasis. But just in case you're curious, the 52 stages are described in the Jewel Necklace Sutra and in the Brahmanet Sutra. And it's 10 stages of faith, 10 stages of security, 10 stages of practice, 10 stages of devotion, 10 stages of development, the stage of near perfect enlightenment, and the stage of perfect enlightenment. So I'm not going to go into that or again with you all day, but there are other schools of Zen that do kind of focus more on the sequential style of learning. It's not our school's way, but it is something that does exist. I think Jocko would probably say that we experience all of those once. And those sutras traditionally are considered to have been written in India and transferred to China. Modern scholarship thinks they were written in China, kind of backdated. So Takuan says that getting mentally stuck in any of these stages is abiding or stopping and being detained. And then he relates this to martial arts. He says, if your mind fixates on the sword swinging at you and stops there, you will be cut down because you will be stuck and unable to respond. So if you think about it, somebody draws a sword and you're like, oh my God, he drew the sword, and you stop processing what's really happening, you don't react to what's coming next, and you die. Instead, we should move with the rhythm of the sword, not thinking about striking or defending, no thoughts of judgment, just responding appropriately. We will take the sword and cut the opponent instead. And this is a reference to Munenori's work, The Life-Giving Sword. So for Munenori, the ultimate martial art is that the opponent's sword becomes yours. And so this can only happen if you have true integration. So if your mind stops, if you get stuck in either your oh shit reaction or what the opponent's doing, you're not able to be fully integrated in the situation. And this sounds very dramatic, but it gives us insight into how Takuan sees wisdom. This is not about discursive thought, where we deeply intellectualize about some issue or question. Wisdom is not collecting facts or memorizing passages from a book. Wisdom is also not about achievement, and I think that's why he mentions those, bodhisattva levels. This is not, I get a certain level of achievement and then I'm a wise person. If we get stuck at any of these stages, we are abiding in ignorance. Wisdom, in a lot of ways, comes from the body, in my experience. We feel what is the appropriate response. We feel the integration much more than we think about the appropriate response. And so the question is, how do we embody the wisdom that is always available to us? This is about intuitive response, not getting caught in the minutiae of our own thoughts and judgments. The definition of wisdom, if you go look it up in the dictionary, is a combination of experience, knowledge, and judgment. So again, it's not intellectual facts. Wisdom is being open to see what is going on in front of us, inside of us, and responding in the most appropriate way. And for Takuan, that's really important. That's that intuitive response. You can't intellectualize that. And when I was doing this, I thought this is a lot like the description of compassion, which cannot be separated from wisdom. Wisdom and compassion are the work of the left, right, of the cloth. Right? Sometimes people say the two sides of the same coin, but to me, even that feels too separate. I really like that work of left. They weave together. Compassion is an arm reaching back to the pillow in the middle of the night. We don't intellectualize about the pillow. We don't get caught thinking about how to move our arm, or judging ourselves for not being comfortable, or judging the pillow for not keeping us comfortable. We don't memorize facts about the pillow. whether it's a down pillow or a foam pillow. We don't care if the case is linen or cotton or what the thread count is. We just adjust the pillow, and then we probably forget we ever did it. Because it's not special. It's just an open, intuitive response. It's nothing special, but it's exactly what the situation called for to alleviate suffering. So wisdom and compassion is reaching back to the pillow. And this is how swordsmanship should be as well. Of course, we learn and practice particular techniques and strategies. But in the moment of the fight, we have to drop our own agenda. We sense the space that we should step, the blow that should be thrown. The unfolding of the moment includes us, our opponent, and the space in between. And yet also none of those things, because those are just arbitrary divisions we create in our mind. There's just this moment where we reach back to the pillow in the middle of the night, and then we forget it ever happened. I sometimes call this fighting with a soft heart, because you have to be vulnerable to be able to be part of that moment and feel what really needs to be done. You can't be locked down and then say, I'm going to be locked down and protected and separate, but then also feel what's happening and be in the moment. It doesn't work that way. This is advice I give to my students all the time, especially in tournaments, where there's a greater tendency to get stuck, especially in the outcome of the fight. Focusing on the outcome is just getting stuck in the after, which is just as bad as getting stuck in the before. We are still abiding somewhere rather than being free to be part of the moment and respond. So I always tell them, there's only this one fight in all the world. There's no before or after. And then when it's gone, we forget about it and it never happened. And there's only this fight in all the world, and there's no before and after. This advice can apply to any activity in our lives: gardening, cooking, raising children. We can have an agenda or goals and things we want, and that's important. But in the moment, there is only this. When we try to be fully engaged in the process that is unfolding, and we don't get caught in our ideas about the details or the before and the after. We engage in this. Coming back to the sword though, if we see the sword and we stop, we are projecting a snapshot of our idea of a fixed thing, rather than movement that's really happening. And I always like to think about, I love those time-lapse videos of the plants, right? It's a seed, and then it's a tree, and then the tree falls back. And we like to go, that's a seed, that's a tree, that's a log. Right? We like to make little snapshots. But it's just this process that's happening. And that's what we do. We like to make little snapshots. And we might also project our thoughts or our feelings onto that snapshot. Fear or anxiety of the blow that's coming, anticipation that might not be correct. Because if we're guessing what's coming next, then we're clearly in the after, but not what's happening right then. All of this leads us to not being free to be part of the process that's developing. We get stuck in our ideas of what's happening, and that means we have a false understanding of what is, which is delusion. And then we get stuck there, which is abiding. And this is something that is so easy to see in martial arts and swordsmanship. At earlier stages, students, they freeze, right? They see something and they flinch and they freeze. Sometimes they even close their eyes and turn away. More advanced students get an idea in their head of how the fight's going to be, and they can't adjust to what's really happening. But this experience happens in everyday life. We see a person or a situation, and we get fixated on that idea that we have. We can't respond to the process of what's really going on. We freeze, we turn away, we get caught up in our ideas of right and wrong, of labels, of creating narrative, and we stop responding freely to what's right in front of us. And this is the affliction of abiding in ignorance. Takuan doesn't go into this, but I would just add that it's not just us that is afflicted in this abiding ignorance. When we do this, we cause more suffering to the people around us as well. I think sword fighting is very dramatic and a big part of my life, but I'm probably somewhat unusual in the room. But I think all of us have gone into meetings, and we definitely have felt abiding in the affliction of ignorance, and probably made that meeting a little more unpleasant for everybody that was in the room. And so in a sword fight, when we get stuck on where the sword is, we get cut down and we die. When we do this in everyday life, we are no longer cognizant of the fact that we are engaged in the arising interplay of the moment. We confuse our ideas and feelings about a moment with the moment itself. We start to believe that we are separate. We are here and they are there, that we get to judge. And so in a sword fight, we might die, but I would say when we get stuck in this place, we die to the moment that is happening right there. And I think that words are very important, and I think Takuan was very intentional in his words. He says it's the affliction of abiding in ignorance. Why didn't he say the affliction of ignorance? It's the affliction of abiding in ignorance. And this is, I think, because our nature, Buddha nature, includes enlightenment and delusion. So delusion exists, but it's also our nature to wake up. If we think about it, why do we practice? Why do we try to keep the precepts? Why bother? Why do we care? Because some part of us, our enlightened nature, is driving us to practice. So this enlightened nature drives us to practice, and in practice, we enact this enlightened nature. So we are able to avoid abiding in ignorance as long as we practice. So moment by moment, we come back. If we realize we were abiding, we get to come back and try again. So every time you come back, you are enacting that enlightened nature that is why, otherwise, why would you care about being a good person or ending suffering? It's that enlightened nature. So ignorance happens, but we try to avoid the affliction of abiding in ignorance. The next chapter is the immovable wisdom of all Buddhas. And luckily, Takuan gives us a couple more definitions, which is helpful. Immovable means unmoving, and wisdom means the wisdom of intelligence. And Takuan is careful to clarify that this is not the immovable of like a non-sentient thing. We're not talking rock, although in our school, a rock is sentient as well. Everything has its own existence, but he's clarifying. Instead, it moves as the mind is wont to move, forward or back, to the left or to the right, in the 10 directions and the 8 points. And the mind that does not stop is called immovable wisdom, which the first time I read that, I thought, well, that's kind of a brain twister. How can a thing be immovable and then move in the 10 directions and the 8 points as it wants to? What is being expressed, though, is the mind that is not knocked off base by events. We remain stable and free in the face of events. We don't get pulled around by our thoughts and emotions. The mind is free to function as it's wont to. So I would say unshakable wisdom might make a little bit more sense to us. Unshakable wisdom. We don't get detained. We don't get caught. And he goes on to say that this is Fudo Mayo. So Fudo, if you haven't seen iconography, very scary looking figure, who's the embodiment of this immovable, enlightened king, and I put or queen because I like to be a little more inclusive, right? Fudo is an intense figure with bared teeth, holding a sword and a rope, often shown in flames, or surrounded by flames. The sword is the sword that cuts through delusion and ignorance. The rope is the rope that binds people who are ruled by violent passions. And the flames are actually the flames that signify the purification of the mind from material desires and the power to consume evil and defilement. So although it is a very kind of intense, scary figure, it's positive imagery. But Fudo can stand in the flames of hell and be unmoved. Fudo is immovable. Right? Fudo is unshakable. And Takuan says that Fudo is our own unmoving and unvacillating body. We're not detained. And I really like this because this can sound very like woo-woo, and then Takuan brings it back, right? Because he's a very practical person. It says, when our mind is detained, our breast is filled with various judgments and emotions, and we get caught. And we get this very physical description because we can talk about what immovable wisdom means. We have this beautiful imagery, and then he brings it back and says, what does it feel like when you get caught? And I know when I get caught, I feel, short of breath. I feel like I have that adrenaline acid in my chest and down my arms. Like I know what it feels like to get caught. And so Takuan brings it right back and says, this is what it feels like to get caught. And he says, so we're going to be unshakable wisdom instead of getting caught. And then he brings it back to swordsmanship. He says, if we get rushed by 10 men with swords, if we are not caught in any of them, we can respond to each one naturally and smoothly. If we get stuck in any one of them, the next attacker will cut us down. So, maybe in a meeting, the metaphorical sense, but if we latch on to one person, the next one's going to get us. We have to be able to respond and flow fluidly. We can't even get stuck on, well, we got that guy, because then you're going to get hit by the next guy. Or if you're thinking about this guy, well, oh gosh, the guy that's coming next, because then you're stuck in the after, right? So we have to be present in the moment. And then Takuan relates this to Kanon Bodhisattva, who's a personification of compassion. And his image of Kanon has 1,000 eyes to see all the suffering of the world and 1,000 arms to reach out to help all the sufferers of the world. And he says, if Kanon's mind got stuck on one arm, all the rest of them would flop and be dead, right? So Kanon can only manifest that full compassion if Kanon is free and undetained, right? Unshakable, not fixated on any one arm. Only when we're free can our full compassion and wisdom arise. So we must remain unshaken even when attacked by 10 men. Only when our wisdom is immovable are we able to have a mind that moves freely in all directions. And I was thinking about one of the images that is usually paired with immovable is the mountain, right? We Zen people, we like mountain imagery. And the mountain is often seen as like the mountain is there, it's stable, and the wind comes, and the rain comes, and the storms come, and it's unbothered. But I don't think that's quite right. I think the mountain and the weather create each other, right? The mountain is the rainy mountain, and the mountain is the stormy mountain, and the mountain is the sunny mountain. And that weather creates the mountain, and the mountain creates the weather, but it's stable. So it's not that it's untouched, it's not that it's separate, right? The weather and the mountain create each other, but it is stable, right? And that's different than, you know, cut myself off from all these things. So in a tournament, if we see an intimidating opponent, if we get knocked off base by who our opponent is or how many people are watching us, we lose touch with our wisdom, our freedom of response, and our full skill is not able to be. I remember I was at a big fighting event, and teachers and people had come from all over the country. And I was fighting with someone from New York, and he's very famous. And so we were sparring, having a good old time. And I was aware that a crowd had gathered, but I was really worried about the guy trying to hit me with the sword. But Adam, the person I was fighting, I saw his eyes flicker to the crowd, and his fighting got distracted. And I remember thinking, and so when we got done, one of the people, it was Araya, you know, came up and everybody was watching you. And Adam was like, oh, we know, like we knew. And I was aware that it happened, but I also knew, because Adam was so good, that if I allowed my mind to go there instead of be with what was really happening, that I was going to get bumped on the head. I'm really anti-getting bumped on the head. So Takuan spends a lot of time. He gives us a lot of examples about this immediacy. He's really a big fan. But he talks about beginner's mind. And he says that the beginner and the expert are actually next to each other. And he says that they're a circle, right? And so the beginner and the expert are the starting and the ending points of the circle. And beginner's mind is a really popular phrase, especially in American Zen, because of Shunryu Suzuki's book. And I think most people, when they hear beginner's mind, they hear no preconceived ideas, right? There's that saying that in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, in the expert's mind, there are few. But I was thinking about something a little different. I was thinking about if you give a 5-year-old kid a stick, you give them a sword, and you watch them just go nuts and have fun, right? Most 5-year-olds, if you give them a stick, it becomes a sword at some point, or like a Christmas wrapping too. And I was thinking about the unbridled joy that comes with beginner's mind, the freedom. It's not just, well, I don't know what's going on, so I'm going to be open to instruction. That 5-year-old, but that 5-year-old is absolutely free and joyful in a way that I think most of us struggle when we're beginners. And then Takuan talks about, because he likes to bring it back, he says, okay, but there is technique. He says you have to do both, principle and technique. This beginner's mind. And I think that makes sense, because you can't take a beginner and say, be like water. That doesn't mean anything there. But what Takuan says is that, again, technique and principle are a circle. Because I think you give that new person a sword, and they're having fun, they're having a good time, they're not worried about it. And then you start teaching them techniques, and then they kind of close down for a while. Because they're like, am I doing this right? Is the teacher watching me when I'm doing this right? And like their mind gets locked down and they're not free anymore. It's not instinct. And then after a while, those techniques get embedded in the body, and then it's instinct again. They get free. So you go from instinct to technique, and then back to instinct. And it's something we talk about in Zen practice. I think most of us have probably heard that very famous saying, when I first started to practice, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. And then after a while of practice, mountains were no longer just mountains and rivers were no longer just rivers. And after a long time of practice, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. And that's what we're talking about. Like, things get special, and then you realize that it just is, right? You could, depending how you look at it, everything is special or nothing is special, because they all just are. And I was thinking about how this relates to the precepts. I think for most of us, precepts work this way. Kobun Chino wrote, and other people have, but I remember his, that the precepts are not a series of rules we follow. They are an aspect of enlightened mind. So someone who has a great deal of understanding is going to naturally act in accord with the precepts. But I don't think any of us come to Zen practice that way. So I think in a lot of ways, we take on the precepts as rules or as technique, right? And we follow them because we want to have less suffering for ourselves and the people around us. And then as we practice, at least I find, people start to instinctively think and act a little bit more in accord with those precepts. And so maybe we take them on as rules, but maybe after a while they become more instinct. And so, yeah, I should have said it time. All right. So Takuan goes on to give us several more examples of not getting caught. And he talks about trees and leaves. And he says, when you face a tree, if you look at a single one of its red leaves, you will not see all the others. When the eye is not set on any one leaf, and you face a tree with nothing at all in mind, any number of leaves are visible to the eye without limit. But if a single leaf holds the eye, it will be as if the remaining leaves were not there. So he's not discounting detail. He's not saying like all the other trees blur out, but he's saying if you get fixated, you lose. And I think all of us have the experience that we get so caught looking at one thing and we don't see everything else around us. How many of us have looked for our glasses that were on our face? Right? Yeah. So that's the thing. It's not discounting details, but it is saying like fixation is not so good. And in swordsmanship, at least in the school that I teach, we call this a soft focus. We don't fixate on the eyes or the sword or anything else. We kind of have a soft focus between ourselves and the opponent, and that lets us take it in. And this is related to what Takuan refers to as no thought, no mind. And so he says in the chapter where one puts the mind, Takuan says that no mind is not putting the mind anywhere. And if you put your mind in the actions of your opponent's body, you're going to get caught there. Put your actions in your mind in the actions of your body, you're going to get caught there. Put your mind in the opponent's sword, put your mind in your sword. So anywhere you put your mind, it's not great, right? Because you're going to get stuck there. You're not going to be free to deal with the whole situation. And I really love, there's a quote that he says, so there are some schools of martial arts that say you should look at the opponent's eyes, or in Japanese martial arts, there's schools that talk about putting your mind in your heart, right? The spot below your belly button, which is where the center of energy is thought to be. And he says that's good, but that's discipline. And he says it shouldn't stop there. And then this is, in all the letter, this is my very favorite thing. He says, this discipline is good, but your mind is like a cat that you have just tied to a tree with a rope. He's like, you can probably force it to stay there, but that's not the natural way of being. And I just think about my cat being so pissed off and jumping around and so offended that he's been tied to a tree somewhere. And so for Takuan, this is artificial, right? This is not the free nature of the cat. And so that's what he's talking about. Like, you can do it, you can shove your mind somewhere, but this is not the freedom that he's talking about. And this is one of the things that I think is very important. Jaku says all the time that a bodhisattva is not great, right? It's not, but we can fall into that trap, right? Discipline can be, and then we tie our cat to the tree, and we wonder why sometimes Zen practice feels like a stick we beat ourselves with. But I think that's what Takuan was talking about. Okay, good one. So I think I'm going to stop and talk about intimacy, and then we'll end it. So just so you know, that's the first two chapters of the first letter. Like, there's no way to move on. So in addition to immediacy, Takuan spends a lot of time about intimacy, and he gives the examples of fire and water for intimacy. And he says fire You can tell somebody about fire all day. You can write poems about fire, you can write songs about fire, but until somebody gets burned, they're not going to know fire. And if you tell somebody about fire when they're freezing to death and you don't give them a fire, it's not going to keep them warm. So the fire is only real. The fire only has an effect when you have a direct experience of it, that intimate experience with it. And it's the same thing with water. You can tell people about water all day, and if they're dying of thirst and you don't give them water, if they don't get to drink water, it's not going to have an effect on them. And this kind of comes back to that circle, that intimacy and immediacy. We can have thoughts about practice, and we can read all the sutras, and we can read all the books, and we can think really deeply about practice. We can have lots of ideas, and none of those are bad things. But the life-changing aspect of practice is that in your body, in your bones. And so it's that intimate experience and relationship with practice that is life-changing, that is life-giving, and it's this intimate and immediate experience with these principles of swordsmanship that Takuan was relating to Munenori, that he says is going to keep you alive and make real change in your martial art and how you're dealing with things. And so it all comes back to, for Takuan, wisdom and compassion is this felt immediate thing. It's this intimacy. It's not a separation. It's not a thing you think about. And so whether it's manifesting in swordsmanship, or it's manifesting in raising a child, or cooking a meal, or washing the dishes, bringing forth this intimate and immediate compassion and wisdom is what we spent a lot of time kind of thinking and talking about. And so I think I'll stop there because I'm running a little long, but I really appreciate that you're listening.